You can bring the jury.
Yes, sir.
Cross-examination.
Afternoon, Doctor.
Hi.
One of the first things you taught me in this case was the definition of a back. You recall that discussion?
Yes, I do.
So would it be fair to say that how medically you define the back may be different than how people communicate to define the back?
It is possible, yes.
Back medically is from the armpit straight down. Is that correct?
There is an imaginary line that goes down the side of the body at the middle of the armpit, and anything behind that line is considered the back.
So the area between the shoulders is that's not the definition of back medically. It's a more expansive area. Is that correct?
The back actually wraps around a little bit on the sides of the body.
And, so when we talk about the injuries to the gentleman in this case, in layman's terms, they're actually to the side, beyond the midline. Is it midline or?
Yes, beyond the lateral midline, but they are to the back.
And in picture, I think it's 153. Stacy, is it 153? Is that correct? States 171, please. Doctor, I think 171 is on the screen now.
Yes.
That's a picture that you took, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And it's a picture of the gentleman's back?
It is a picture of his back.
And on his back, we see the piece of the taser that's in the gentleman's back, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And it's very difficult to see, if you can see it, any of the wounds in his back other than the one on his right shoulder. Is that correct?
The other two are on the margin of the skin. You can see them at the edge, but in this, the body is tilted slightly away from the camera.
Okay. And that's the photograph that you took?
Yes, it is.
Of the gentleman's back?
Yes, it is.
He seems quite muscular in that photograph. Is that correct? Do you find that he's muscular?
Every person's definition of muscular is different.
As would be any person's definition of back. Now, regardless of the definition, you had called him obese earlier.
Yes.
Which we're all rather sensitive to the definition of obese, correct?
I am using the medical definition of obese.
So the medical definition does not take into account the difference in weight between fat and muscle.
That's correct.
And muscle weighs more than fat. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so whatever a person's height is, just to say he's obese, which to a layman may mean fat, to a medical doctor of your caliber and the business you're in, it's purely a weight relationship to height.
That is correct.
And it doesn't take into account the muscle structure of the person in terms of the weight.
That is correct.
In terms of all that definition of obese, medically, it can be fat or it can be muscle. Or it can be bones, it can be hair on the head, it can be whatever that total weight is. Is that correct?
The calculation is a little bit complex, but it takes into account the person's height and the weight mostly. And it's converted to body surface area.
When the gentleman came to the morgue, his hands were wrapped in brown paper bags. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if you would, explain to the jury if that's a normal process.
Yes, it is. The hands are bagged at the scene in order to preserve evidence. And that way, any DNA evidence that may be present on the hands, or in some cases, gunshot residue, that would also be preserved by the paper bags.
And the DNA evidence that would be preserved on the hands is for what purpose, if you know?
In order to identify if there is the DNA of another individual, for example, under the fingernails.
Or on the hands.
Or on the hands.
Or on the back of the hands.
That is correct.
Or on the wrists.
Yes.
That's why bags are placed over the hands to preserve evidence. Correct?
Correct.
Now, when you were present at the autopsy, when you performed the autopsy on April 5th, were there representatives from law enforcement present?
Yes.
And do you recall who they were?
Agent Don Claycomb and Agent Angela Peterson.
Were there any representatives of Mr. Slager present?
I'm sorry?
Were there any representatives of Mr. Slager present?
No.
Who took the bags off the hands of the gentleman?
I took the bags off one hand, and it is possible that the coroner took the bag off the other hand, at least temporarily.
And were those bags preserved?
Yes, they were.
And where did they go after you took them off and the coroner took them off?
They were transferred to Agent Claycomb.
And Agent Claycomb is with the State Law Enforcement Division?
Yes.
Now, do you know whether those bags were placed on the gentleman's hands at the scene of the incident?
I believe they were. I am not sure.
That would be the normal.
That would be the normal procedure.
Now, did you take exemplars from the gentleman to compare DNA with, should DNA of the gentleman be found at another location?
Did I take a DNA standard?
Yes.
From the gentleman, meaning Mr. Scott?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And tell the jury, if you would, what type of exemplar that was.
We take blood as a DNA sample.
And that blood was then transferred to SLED?
Yes, it was.
And the purpose of that is to do DNA comparisons, is that correct?
That is correct.
Other blood is taken from other areas to do toxicology.
That is
examination
correct.
of what's in the blood at the time.
Yes.
Now, did you take hair samples?
Yes, I did.
And what would be the purpose of taking hair samples?
Again, the purpose that we take it for is also for DNA and also for hair comparison as trace evidence.
All right, so for DNA, we have blood and we have hair, so that one could use either the blood or the hair to do that comparison.
Usually the blood is the preferred sample.
Because with the hair, you have to actually get the root of the hair. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
Was that done in this case?
Yes, it was.
And from the hair sample, can one do other testing?
Yes, there can be.
For instance, you sent the blood off to be examined for toxicology purposes. Could the hair be sent off as well for toxicology purposes?
In certain cases, yes, it can.
And that toxicology purposes would then give a history beyond what's present in the body at the moment of death of drug usage. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you did that? You took the hair and provided it to SLED, is that correct?
We took hair samples for trace evidence comparison, and I handed it over to SLED, yes.
Now, I may be getting out of your area, and if I am, please tell me. In other words, out of your area of expertise. Do you know whether or not levels of toxicity, that is, levels of some chemical composition, the actions on the body, if you will, the mind and the body of a person, are different depending on their chronic use or acute use, chronic being long-term use, acute being of the moment of drugs?
In general medical terms, yes.
Now, did you ever get a report back from the toxicology service for the peripheral blood?
Yes, I did.
Did you ever get a report back from toxicological services regarding hair analysis?
No, I did not.
So that this jury then would be deprived of knowledge about how potential chronic use of drugs would affect one's mind and body at the time of their death.
I'm not understanding the question.
It's my understanding that you have said that the medical literature says there is a difference of chemicals, how they act on the body, if they're taken on an occasion, one time, or whether they're chronically used over a long period of time. The effect of the chemicals would be different. Is that correct?
Again, I am not following the question.
I thought that you had indicated that chronic use of chemicals by a person can affect a person in one way that's different from an acute use or a singular use of chemicals.
It can, yes.
And then the next question was, did you have from the peripheral blood the chemical analysis of Mr. Scott at the time of his death?
Did I receive the peripheral blood results?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And did you ever receive the results of the chronic use taken from the hair samples? Did you ever receive a report on that to include in your report?
That is not done by autopsy protocol.
Did you ever receive, the question is, did you ever receive a report back from toxicology evaluation of the hair samples?
No.
And the reason is because that isn't the norm. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that is why you keep hair sample exemplars indefinitely, so that at some future time, if it becomes important, they can be examined. Is that correct?
We do not keep any evidence at MUSC.
Is evidence kept?
We only keep the biological samples for 1 year.
Were the hair samples kept?
I do not know. I signed them over to law enforcement.
And who in law enforcement would that have been?
Agent Don Claycomb of SLED.
So the hair exemplars that you took that could be used for evaluation of chemicals into that body and or DNA was turned over to SLED.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Because it's not your protocol as the medical examiner to do that.
I'm a forensic pathologist, not a medical examiner. This is a coroner system.
Dr. Tormos, whatever your position is, a medical examiner, a forensic pathologist, were those exemplars turned over as part of what you do as a profession?
Yes, they were.
And the purpose for turning them over is to allow further testing. Is that correct?
Allow for further testing.
Yes.
Yes.
So if there's a question that arises, let's say anytime in the next 18 months, those are exemplars are preserved, or at least you turn them over to law enforcement for preservation in case further testing is warranted. Is that correct?
Again, can you repeat the question?
Do you know whether or not the hair samples were maintained?
I already said I do not know.
But you turned them over to SLED.
Yes, I did.
In your testimony earlier today, you indicated that there was no, did you call it stippling?
Stippling.
And stippling is what again?
When burning particles of gunpowder strike the skin and create little burned abrasions.
And would that be from a contact wound?
No, sir.
What was the contact wound you had discussed?
The contact wound would deposit soot on the body surface.
So a contact wound, if I would, I'm holding my right index finger against my left arm. A contact wound is just that, where the gun is up against the skin.
Up against the skin.
Usually found in gunshot suicide.
Yes, it can be found in gunshot suicides.
And then you testified there was some other markings where one could tell within 3 feet.
Within 3 feet or so, you get the stippling on the skin.
And if somebody's wearing clothing, would that interfere with the stippling on the skin?
Clothing could interfere with the stippling, yes.
And at the time that Mr. Scott's body arrived in your possession, he was clothed?
Yes, he was, although the shirts were cut.
And his hands were bagged?
Yes.
And the bags were removed?
At least one was.
And there was testing done of his hands in your presence?
No, not in my presence.
So if anyone did testing, it wasn't done during the autopsy?
It was not done during the autopsy, no.
Do you know if the testing of the hands was done by anybody when the body was still at the medical university?
I believe that the coroner opened the bag to do fingerprint identification.
And what time was that?
Prior to the autopsy.
What time was that?
I do not know.
The coroner entered the morgue and took the bags off the hands of Mr. Scott before you had an opportunity to examine them?
Yes.
And was evidence removed from his hands?
Not that I am aware of.
Because you weren't there.
I was not there.
But fingerprints were taken in the middle of the night of Mr. Scott. Isn't that correct?
I do not know what time it is, at what time it was, but sometime prior to the autopsy.
In your report that you have before you, would it indicate that the body bag number had been changed out because somebody went into the morgue in the middle of the night and took the bags off the hands?
Yes.
Well, tell the jury about that part.
The body bag was transported to the Medical University of South Carolina and it was sealed with tag number 376. At our facility, the deputy coroner and a SLED agent opened the body bag sealed, confirmed the identification, and sealed the bag again, this time with tag 379. And then the body transport bag was received in our autopsy room, sealed with tag number 379.
So the body seal was not the same number that was placed on it at the incident site. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you have testified, although you weren't there, the purpose for that was to identify Mr. Scott.
That's what I was told.
By fingerprints.
Yes.
Even though everybody knew who it was. Correct?
I do not know if they know who he was.
The testing for trace evidence, if there was any, the testing for gunshot residue, if there was any, was done after you performed the autopsy. Is that correct?
I am not sure about that.
You don't know who did it, when they did it?
I do not.
Thank you, Doctor.
No question.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me call your next witness. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you go to the jury room for a few minutes. Please do not discuss the case. In recess for a few minutes. Ready for the jury? Pardon?
Judge, a while back, and I believe again shortly before the trial started, we had made a motion in limine regarding character evidence of the victim in this case, Mr. Scott. Knowing, of course, that the autopsy results would yield that there had been some cocaine used by Mr. Scott, and I believe Mr. Savage crossed Mr. Scott's son about his knowledge of prior cocaine use. So certainly we have known that that would be an issue coming out in this case. However, my concern with our next witness, who is a forensic toxicologist, is the cross-examination as we have seen conducted with other witnesses throughout this case, which assumes facts that are not in evidence, and frankly in this case won't be coming into evidence. Questions, it's the old, were you aware that he beat his wife kind of question? Well, no, because that didn't happen, and that's not in evidence and won't be. We have a distant 30-year-old discharge, general discharge from the military for marijuana use. We have a record from an employer from some years ago for an accident at work where there was a drug test performed that was positive for cocaine. And that's the extent of the history that I'm aware of.
What year was it, did you say?
I'll have to get that year.
November 14th, 2014.
So just over a year from this use. I don't believe that.
Less than 6 months.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't believe that equates to chronic cocaine use. And so I would ask that the court, in line with its ruling in limine, that cross-examination regarding the terminology chronic user and things like that, not be allowed because it's more prejudicial than it is probative in the situation.
Defense?
The medical testimony is that chronic users have different effects than acute users. The questions then were, what attempts did the state take to distinguish between acute and chronic, knowing that there's a difference? As Ms. Wilson said, they've known about this for 15, 16 months. So we would request that the court not limit us based on the state's failure to do their job, so that medical testimony can be given about the difference between chronic user using cocaine and acute user using cocaine, knowing that that cocaine was part of this situation. So we have an incident.
Cocaine was part of what situation?
The incident of April 4th, 2015. There was cocaine and cocaine metabolites, coethylene in the body, in peripheral blood. And if the state attempts, as I believe they are, put up an expert that says this doesn't have much of an effect, the medical science is such that it is appropriate. Chronic cocaine user, that the effect would be much different than an acute user. In addition to the incident on November 14th of 2014, less than 6 months before this, there is evidence that we will have that he was tested on April 29th of 01 positive for cocaine, and that he had a previous experience with drugs while he was in the military. So, we think it's essential to understand the pain resistance of Mr. Scott on April 4th, 2015, as well as the potential for what the medical world is calling psychotherapy, which took place on April 4th, 2015. That is the purpose of our question. And they had the ability to...
You said medical delirium. Excited delirium. What is that?
It's a medical term where, because of the combination of drugs and alcohol on certain individuals, they can act out of character, they can become highly aggressive, they're pain resistant, they act in a very short period of time in reaction to authority, reaction to stress. We believe that that is exactly what happened because of the medical condition of Mr. Scott on that morning.
Do you have an expert that you believe will offer admissible testimony that Mr. Scott suffered from excited delirium on the date and time in question?
Dr. Thomas, who's the medical examiner from Mecklenburg County in Charlotte, we anticipate will testify that based on his training experience, that is what Mr. Scott was experiencing on morning before 2015. I'm sorry, Thomas Owen. He's the medical examiner from Mecklenburg County. I think we provided that information to the court, the state executive.
Ms. Wilson?
Your Honor, again, 10, under a 403 analysis, a 2001 positive test and a 2014 positive test do not, a chronic user may.
I am to determine that based on a matter of law, or
Well,
what?
I think that, well, we certainly aren't there yet. And Mr. Savage says he has some doctor who's going to testify to that, and that'll be something we will ask to take up out of the presence of the jury, for sure, whenever he gets to that point in his case, when he wants to call that expert. I believe he mentioned that Dr. Owens is a medical examiner or a pathologist,
Yes.
not a forensic toxicologist.
He's also learned in toxicology.
All right, anything further?
I don't want to be repetitive, Judge, but the evidence to confirm the chronic use is in the hands of the state. And the state knew that this was an issue 15 months.
What evidence are you referring to?
The hair. The testimony was that the hair was used for multiple purposes. It was used for toxicology, it was used for trace evidence, hair comparisons, DNA, but included among that was the use of chemicals. I used what I said, so I didn't say drugs, but chemicals.
Anything further?
No, sir.
All right, the motion to eliminate is granted. That evidence cannot be offered until such time as the court has conducted a hearing and determined the admissibility of this expert opinion on the theory that Mr. Savage espoused. And it cannot be through a cross-examination of this witness unless this witness confirms through their own opinion that this is an area of expertise and the court determines that that is admissible. In short, the motion is granted. If you'll bring the jury.
We may want to hire this expert on whatever area this expert is on.
All right.
Do that now?
Yes.
Okay. Jimmy Garvin?
No, just have them go back to the jury room.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please state your first and last name and spell your last name loudly, clearly, and clearly.
My name is Demetra, D-E-M-E-T-R-A, Garvin, G-A-R-V-I-N, and I'm commonly known as Demi, D-E-M-I, Garvin.
And what is your occupation?
I am currently a forensic toxicologist and also a quality and business development manager.
Can you tell the court what your educational background is?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and a Doctor of Clinical Pharmacy from the University of South Carolina College of Pharmacy in Columbia.
And Dr. Garvin, what specific training do you have in the field of forensic toxicology?
I am, pardon me, I have had, this is my 32nd year in forensic science, specifically forensic toxicology and drug chemistry. And I have obtained my pharmacy license here in South Carolina, board certification in forensic toxicology, have taken numerous courses beyond both of my degrees in pharmacology, toxicology, instrumentation associated with the science, and that would be probably the sum total of my additional training.
Where are you employed now?
I'm currently employed with Forensic Science Network in Columbia. It's a consulting firm that provides forensic services, more specifically toxicology, forensic toxicology, and criminalistics services to pathologists, coroners, law enforcement, and the legal community in South Carolina and in Georgia. And also, I'm employed as a business development and quality manager for a company called DPX Technologies in Columbia, South Carolina.
What is that, DPX Technologies?
DPX Technologies, DPX is an acronym that stands for Dispersive Pipette Extraction Technology. It is a technology that was developed by one of my colleagues, another forensic toxicologist, Dr. William Brewer, who holds the patent in the technology, and essentially it is used in a variety of practice settings to include clinical medicine, forensics, food safety, and provides an extraction device for testing in those areas, pharmaceutical industry as well.
Before the Forensic Science Network and before DPX Technology, were you employed by SLED?
Yes, I was a staff forensic toxicologist and also operating as a clinical toxicologist for several years, as well as a drug chemist for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division for 16 years.
And after you left SLED, you went to Richland County?
Yes, in 2000, I was employed with the State Law Enforcement Division from 1984 to 2000. And then in 2000, I transitioned to the Richland County Sheriff's Department, where I assisted Sheriff Lott in the development of what ultimately became a full-service forensic sciences laboratory. And during my 15-year tenure there, I was a supervisor of the drug chemistry section, then became the assistant laboratory director, and finally the laboratory director.
And how many forensic toxicology cases would you say you've handled, if you could guess?
Thousands.
And have you had any continuing education in the field of forensic toxicology? And do you often teach in that field?
Yes, sir. I do teach at the University of South Carolina, a forensic science course. Pretty much have done that yearly since about 2000, I think, thereabouts. And I am required to obtain continuing education and have been required to do so for a number of years, yes.
And have you been qualified as an expert in the field of forensic toxicology?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know how many times?
At least 200 times.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time we'd offer her as an expert in forensic toxicology.
Says the defense.
Therefore, do I have to
Yes.
The field of your expertise encompasses what? What is forensic toxicology expertise? What's contained?
Forensic toxicology is the science of drugs, alcohols, and other poisons which are identified from biological matrices in both living and deceased individuals. And then once those compounds are identified and perhaps quantitated, that is a concentration or an amount is associated with them in the biological matrix, there is an interpretation that follows from that. And then if requested to do so, the forensic toxicologist would then provide that information in a court of law.
So are you familiar with the lab analyses of biological material in terms of foreign substances? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're familiar with behavior?
I would say that the effects of drugs, alcohols, and other poisons, the effects on behavior are a component of forensic toxicology. Yes, sir.
And what specifically academic training or field experience have you had with the behavior of drug addicts or people who use foreign chemicals in their system?
Well, behavioral effects in association with drugs, alcohols, and poisonings are a subdiscipline of what one learns as a forensic toxicologist in his or her training, and that would I would say that was a component of my training and experience in the field.
So you have made observations of people who are under the influence?
Well, by example, early in my career, as a function of my training and the development of my expertise in driving under the influence cases, I did in fact participate in dosing trials with respect to the use of alcohol in individuals to observe effects associated with increasing concentrations of alcohol. Yes, sir.
How about the use of cocaine?
No, sir.
Do you have any experience at all to associate amounts of cocaine with behavior?
Insofar as what we are taught didactically in terms of increasing concentrations of the drug under specific conditions, the answer would be yes. By physical observation, the answer would be no.
You're familiar with medical research in cocaine usage, that chronic usage of cocaine has a different effect than a single use of cocaine. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Are you familiar with the medical literature in cocaine use, distinguishing between a chronic user and a single-use user behavior?
Behaviorally? To some extent, yes, sir.
And so you are in position to testify as part of your training experience on that issue?
I don't know unless I'm posed the question.
Fair enough. I succeeded.
Thank you.
Any objection as to this witness being qualified in the field offered?
To the field of forensic toxicology.
Yes.
Okay.
She's admitted.
And, Your Honor, I can continue down my
All right.
questions, and we have no intent to get into behavior with this witness, and that was the purpose of the motion in limine. Dr. Garvin, your firm, Forensic Science
I
Network.
don't need to know all of her entirety of her testimony. It's the, granted the motion in limine, if this witness had some opinion based on her review of the record that Mr. Scott was a chronic cocaine user, whatever that means, and that she has some view regarding what constitutes excited delirium, and that he suffered from that on this day, then I will rule on that issue if no one has posed any questions to her that would make me believe that she has any view on that issue at this point.
That was the purpose of my motion, Your Honor. I don't believe that she does have that view. That's not necessarily her field, but what we have seen happen time and time again is these questions being asked and hung out there when Mr. Savage knows that this isn't the witness, or that the witness who's on the stand is not the witness who would be the one to speak to that. So I can ask the witness, Dr. Garvin, you work with FSN, who works with pathologists, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you, in your role with Forensic Science Network, your firm did an analysis with regards to the cocaine levels in Walter Scott as supplied to the medical or the pathologist.
We have an objection to that.
What is the objection?
The Crawford objection, this witness did not perform the testing that we solicited and suppressed.
Well, you're objecting to, restate the question, please.
Did your firm become involved in the analyzing the results of the test from NMS Labs?
After the testing was performed on the submitted biological specimens, Forensic Science Network, myself and my colleague, Dr. Brewer, were involved in the interpretation of the results from the toxicology testing.
So is that what forensic toxicologists do? Analyze results?
They can perform the testing, and they can also provide the interpretation of the results, or both.
Okay. And in this instance, NMS Labs performed the testing, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then your firm, you and Dr. Brewer, performed the analysis of those levels?
The interpretation of the results from the testing.
Okay. And your interpretation was then passed on to the pathologist for their reliance for their autopsy?
Yes, in this case, Dr. Brewer did the evaluation, and that was provided to Dr. Tormos at the Medical University.
And you have been involved in a review of all of that?
Yes.
Okay. And is it common in your field of forensic toxicology to review tests performed by others?
Yes.
And to review interpretations and to provide your own?
Yes.
And was your interpretation of the results from NMS the same as Dr. Brewer's?
Yes.
Now, with regards to the results of the tests,
What was Dr. Brewer's?
that's what I was,
Okay.
that's where I'm
All right,
going.
thank you. Thought you were moving to something else.
Not exactly. So, Dr. Brewer, with regards to the blood that was sent by the pathologist to NMS for a tox screen, can you tell the court what drugs were screened for?
The testing that was requested was the analysis code is what is known as an 8052B. The B stands for blood, and that is described as an expanded postmortem toxicology panel and includes a number of compounds which include alcohols, common drugs of abuse, and a number of therapeutic agents and their breakdown products.
And those tests, are they sometimes used by, or the results of those tests, sometimes used by pathologists to determine a cause of death?
Yes.
Or a contributing factor of death?
Yes.
And it's common in your field to help interpret those levels to see if they had an effect on the cause of death?
Yes, to assist in the interpretation and serve as a resource to the pathologists and coroners. Yes.
And with regards to the blood of Walter Scott that was tested by NMS, what were the levels of drugs that were found in his samples?
For the testing panel that was performed on the submitted peripheral blood sample from Mr. Scott, there were 3 compounds that were identified with associated concentrations, and they were cocaine in the amount of 36 nanograms per milliliter, cocaethylene in the amount of 26 nanograms per milliliter, and benzoyl-ecgonine in the amount of 1,300 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. And with those levels, first of all, let me ask you, before we get to the levels, the type of sample that was used for the test, the peripheral blood, you said.
Yes.
And is that a best practice for analyzing for drugs?
It is considered the use of a peripheral blood sample, whether in the context of an autopsy or in the case where an autopsy is not performed, is considered an appropriate specimen because it is obtained as far away from the chest cavity or central portion of the body as possible. The reason for that is very often it represents a better window, if you will, of insight into what the actual concentration of a particular drug might have been on or about the time of death, whereas samples that are drawn, blood samples that are drawn from the heart or surrounding area have an increased risk of having drugs reported at higher concentrations, or perhaps being contaminated if there's trauma to the body.
Okay, so with a gunshot wound or several gunshot wounds, in your experience, it would be better to have peripheral blood used than blood from the center cavity?
As toxicologists, I recommend to the greatest extent possible to obtain a peripheral blood sample whenever possible.
And you've seen the autopsy in this case?
No, I was not present at the autopsy.
Well, I mean, you've seen the report that describes the timing of the sample collection.
Actually, no, I have not seen the autopsy report.
Okay, so if the autopsy was performed within 25 hours of Mr. Scott's death, does that affect the ability to get an accurate reading of cocaine levels in the blood?
The longer the postmortem interval is, which is defined as the time from the death until the time the sample is collected, the longer that period is, the more time elapses, the more there can be an effect on the concentration of a drug or its breakdown product identified in a biological specimen, particularly blood. It is drug dependent, and there are other factors that can influence the result. But again, to the greatest extent possible, we want to have a shortened interval, and a period of about 24 hours is not uncommon.
In looking at the results, what can you tell us about the time of ingestion for cocaine?
Yes, Your Honor, unless we receive a report of Rule 5 of this witness's testimony, proposed testimony, we have no report.
Response?
Your Honor, they have the brain tissue report from NMS that we actually got from them, and they have what's been marked Rule 5, SAW 894, 895, 896, and 897. Regarding the tox results, we're now asking the witness whose firm was involved and who has examined the analysis, along with Dr. Brewer, what these results mean. There hasn't been a report as of that, but she certainly has been available, and as has Dr. Brewer, and I believe Dr. Brewer has spoken with Mr. Savage.
So this just seems to know a lot about me, but I don't know anything about this. I've never received a report from Dr. Brewer other than the toxicology report that he did not perform. It was performed by NMS, but I don't have any case-specific report from Dr. Brewer and NMS from the witness regarding the interpretation that one might have regarding the information provided by NMS.
Yes, ma'am.
There is no report, Your Honor.
We object to that.
Not overrule the objection.
With regards to the levels, what the levels for cocaine and cocoethylene and the benzo, can you tell the court what you can tell from those levels regarding the timing of the cocaine and alcohol ingestion?
Well, there is no alcohol reported as being present. However, the compound cocaethylene is formed when cocaine and alcohol or ethanol are present in the circulation together in the body. So at some point prior to the collection of this specimen, Mr. Scott had consumed alcohol in conjunction with cocaine. Insofar as the timing of the use of cocaine and alcohol, for that matter, there is no way to determine that from the toxicology results.
Okay, you mentioned that there was no alcohol, but that the cocoethylene meant that alcohol and cocaine were present together at some point.
Yes, that's correct.
The alcohol would have already been metabolized.
Yes, it was likely burned off by the liver or degraded, if you will, and no longer present. That's correct.
Leaving just the byproduct of cocoethylene, correct?
Leaving just the cocoethylene, yes.
Okay, and then the cocaine itself had not burned off yet. Is that correct?
No, there was still parent cocaine at the time the sample was collected.
And so with these levels, you can't pinpoint timing. Can you pinpoint the mode of ingestion?
The route of ingestion? The route of ingestion?
Yeah.
No, ma'am.
So you can't tell if it's smoked, snorted, IV,
No.
regardless?
No.
Is there anything about these levels that suggests, even though you can't give a precise time, is there anything that suggests that it would have been within several hours to even many hours the night before?
Either is possible. Yes, that's correct.
How about many days before?
You'd have to be more specific.
2 days, would that be possible?
It's possible.
Probably not.
It's difficult to say. It is possible, yes.
So, but more likely within hours instead of days?
Hours to several days.
Now, you also have reviewed the NMS lab reports issued to the Savage firm regarding brain tissue in this case. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And the drugs that were tested for in the brain tissue test, was that the same type of panel that was run for the blood?
No, it was not.
What was the difference?
The testing that was performed in the peripheral blood sample, which was collected at autopsy, was a more expansive panel, if you will, a more extended panel. It, as I testified to earlier, it contained, it included alcohols, therapeutic drugs, and drugs of abuse. The testing that was performed, there were three, to be more specific, there were three matrices that were tested in the second testing event, and they included submission of a fluid which was documented to be formalin. There was neat. There was fluid documented to be formalin, which appeared to have bathed the brain tissue, and then there was the brain tissue itself. So there were three items that were tested in the second testing event. And in that scenario, the fluid which bathed the brain as well as the brain tissue, the panel was more truncated and included only drugs of abuse and alcohols. The fluid, the neat formalin, that is a standard or reference formalin, was tested only for the presence of cocaine, cocoethylene, and benzoyl-ecgonine.
Okay. Now, the results from the brain tissue test, do they do anything to shed more light as to the timing of the ingestion of cocaine by Mr. Scott?
No.
Does it do any more to tell you about the dosage, as in the amount of cocaine ingested, or the route or the mode of administration?
No.
Are the results from the brain tissue testing what you would expect to see after having seen the testing that was done on the blood?
Well, they're independent matrices. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that at some point, Mr. Scott administered or was self-administered or was administered cocaine. Cocaine crossed into the brain and then subsequently was broken down to benzoyl-ecgonine, which can only come from cocaine.
And that's what happens when people use cocaine. It gets absorbed into the brain
Yes,
that way.
yes.
Okay. Does anything about the toxicology results from the peripheral blood or the brain tissue give you any insight as to whether the use was chronic or acute?
No.